That radio exchange, or something very close to it, reportedly took place on a warm night in the late summer of 2011, at a small marine outpost in the high desert of Southern California. It was not an emergency call. No weapon was fired. No perimeter was breached. And officially nothing happened. But what makes this particular account worth telling isn't that one Marine saw something he couldn't explain while standing post at night. It's that over the course of roughly 11 days at least 5 Marines, on different nights at different posts, during different watch rotations, reported observing what appears to have been the same thing. And each of them did so reluctantly, often only after being pressed by the sergeant of the guard or the corporal of the guard for details on why they were requesting early relief or acting unusual at turnover. None of them had been told what the others had seen. Not right away. That part came later, and when it did, it changed the way some of them talked about the place for good. This is what they reported. In the years I've spent collecting and reviewing accounts from military personnel, active duty, reserve, retired, separated, there's a specific category of report that stands out. Not because the events described are the most dramatic or the most terrifying, but because the pattern behind them is so difficult to dismiss. These are cases where multiple people, independently and without coordination, report the same anomalous observation, often at the same location, often at roughly the same time of night, and do so without knowing that anyone else has already said the same thing. It's a pattern that, in intelligence work, would be called corroboration. And in any other context, it would be taken seriously. What I want to share today is a case that fits that pattern almost too neatly. It involves a small group of Marines assigned to a temporary security detail at a support side compound during a large-scale training exercise in the Mojave. The setting was not a combat zone. There was no enemy fire. No IEDs. No hostile contact. The only thing that happened, if the accounts are accurate, is that after midnight for nearly 2 weeks, something was seen standing just outside the illuminated perimeter, and it was always described the same way. I should be clear, I do not know with certainty what these Marines saw. I've spoken with 2 of them directly, and corresponded with a third through a mutual contact. The accounts are remarkably consistent, but consistency alone doesn't make something true. What I can say is that after reviewing the details, I have not been able to find a clean explanation that accounts for all of them. And I've tried. The exercise was a large combined arms event, the kind that brings thousands of Marines into the desert for weeks at a time, spread across hundreds of square miles of open terrain. For those unfamiliar, these exercises are designed to simulate the operational tempo and complexity of a real deployment. Units conduct live-fire maneuvers, logistics operations, casualty evacuation drills, and force-on-force engagements using blank ammunition and laser systems. They run day and night. Sleep is limited. And for the Marines pulling security on the support side installations, the supply points, the field maintenance areas, the command nodes, the job mostly consists of standing post. Standing post, for anyone who hasn't done it, is one of the most tedious and psychologically grinding tasks in the Marine Corps. You are assigned to a fixed position on a perimeter. You have your weapon, your flak and Kevlar, a radio, and sometimes a set of night vision optics, usually a PVS-14 monocular. You stand there or walk a short route for the duration of your watch. During these exercises, shifts typically ran 4 hours, rotating through the night in a standard 3-post rotation, 2000 to 0000, 0000 to 0400, and 0400 to 0800. Your job is to observe. You watch the wire. You watch the road. You watch the open ground. And you report anything that moves. Under normal circumstances, the biggest challenge is staying awake. The compound in question was set back from the main exercise area by several kilometers. It served as a logistics node, a place where supply vehicles staged, fuel bladders were positioned, and maintenance crews worked on vehicles coming out of the field. It was not large. The footprint was maybe 200 meters on its longest axis. The perimeter was marked by triple-strand concertina wire in most places, with a vehicle entry control point on the east side and a pedestrian access point on the north. The terrain around it was flat, open desert broken by low scrub and scattered rock formations. Visibility during the day was excellent. At night, under a clear sky with no moon, you could see reasonably well with night vision, better in some directions than others depending on ambient light and terrain features. There were 4 fixed posts. Post 1 covered the vehicle ECP. Post 2 faced south, overlooking a dry wash that ran roughly east to west about 150 meters out. Post 3 sat on the northwest corner, where the ground rose slightly toward a low ridgeline maybe 300 meters distant. Post 4 was a roving post, a walking route that covered the gaps between the fixed positions. The compound was manned by roughly 40 Marines from a combat logistics battalion, plus a handful of attachments from other units. The security detail, the post standers, was drawn from the battalion's organic security element, augmented by a few Marines pulled from other sections when bodies were short. For the first several days of the exercise, nothing unusual happened. The Marines stood their posts, pulled their shifts, conducted radio checks every 30 minutes, and reported to the corporal of the guard at turnover. Conditions were what you'd expect: hot during the day, cool at night, dry, windy at intervals, and monotonous. The first incident, or at least the first one anyone mentioned, occurred on what I believe was the 5th or 6th night. The Marine who reported it was a lance corporal named Vargas. Or that's the name I'll use here. I've agreed to change identifying details. He was on post 3, the northwest corner, pulling the midnight to 4 shift. He'd been on that post before on prior nights without issue. He was not a new Marine. He had 1 deployment behind him and was considered reliable by his NCOs. According to Vargas, the first 2 hours of his shift were uneventful. He conducted his radio checks on schedule. He scanned his sector. He noted the usual ambient sounds: wind, the distant rumble of generators from the compound, occasional vehicle noise from the main exercise area to the east. At some point after 0200, he noticed what he initially took to be a coyote standing on the low rise to his northwest. This was not unusual. Coyotes were common in the training area. Marines on post saw them regularly, and they were generally ignored unless they approached the wire. What caught his attention was that the shape did not move. He watched it for what he estimates was 3 to 4 minutes. Through his PVS-14, the figure was visible against the slightly lighter sky, a silhouette on the ridgeline. It appeared to be standing upright. Not on 4 legs. Upright. Vargas told me that his first thought was that it was another Marine. Maybe someone from an adjacent unit had wandered outside their perimeter, or a vehicle crew had pulled off the road and was stretching their legs. That kind of thing wasn't common, but it wasn't impossible during a large exercise. He considered calling it in but decided to watch for another minute first. The figure remained stationary. And then Vargas noticed something that, in his words, made the hair on his arms stand up. It had no infrared signature. Every Marine in the field during that exercise was required to carry an IR marker, a small beacon visible only through night vision devices. Vehicles had them. Personnel had them. Even the supply points had small IR chem lights marking access routes. If the figure on the ridgeline had been a Marine or any coalition personnel, Vargas should have seen some kind of IR glow. There was nothing. Just the shape. Dark, still, and standing at what he estimated was 250 meters. He keyed his radio. COG Post 3. I have a possible figure standing on the ridge to my northwest. No IR signature. requesting you come take a look. The corporal of the guard, a corporal whose name I don't have, walked over from the guardhouse, which was a GP medium tent near the center of the compound. By the time he reached post 3 and looked through his own optics, Vargas said the figure was gone. The COG told him it was probably a coyote that had been sitting upright and moved off. Vargas accepted that. Or at least he said he did. He finished his shift without further incident and went to sleep. That, by itself, would have been forgettable. A shape in the desert. A coyote at a funny angle. Darkness and fatigue playing tricks. Every Marine who has ever stood post at night has a version of this story. But what happened over the next several nights is what turned it into something else. 2 nights later, a different Marine, a PFC I'll call Donovan, was on post 2, the south-facing position overlooking the dry wash. He was on the same midnight to 4 shift. He had not been told about Vargas's sighting. According to the Marine I spoke with who later compared their accounts, Vargas hadn't mentioned it to anyone outside the guardhouse. He was a little embarrassed about it and figured it wasn't worth bringing up. Donovan's report came at roughly 0130. He told the sergeant of the guard that he had observed a figure standing in the wash, motionless, at approximately 100 meters. He described it as tall, taller than he would have expected, and standing with its arms at its sides. No visible equipment. No pack. No weapon. No IR signature. Just a shape, standing in the open, facing the compound. Donovan said he watched it for maybe 2 minutes. He did not call it in by radio immediately because he thought it might be a shadow or a trick of the light. When he finally keyed the radio and described what he was looking at, the SOG asked him for a more precise bearing. Donovan gave one. The SOG said he'd send the rover, post 4, to check. By the time the roving post reached a position where they could see into the wash from a different angle, there was nothing there. The rover scanned the area with his PVS-14 and saw nothing. No person. No animal. No movement. The SOG walked the wire and checked Donovan's position himself. He looked through Donovan's optics. He saw nothing unusual. He told Donovan to stay alert and finish his shift. Donovan complied. But when he came off post at 0400, he told the Marine relieving him to keep an eye on the wash. He didn't explain why. He just said, "Watch that wash." The relief Marine, whose name I do not have, reportedly saw nothing during the 0400 to 0800 shift. At this point, 2 Marines had independently reported a stationary, upright figure in the desert at night. Both after midnight, both without IR signature, both observing something that vanished before anyone else could confirm it. And neither had spoken to the other. It was the sergeant of the guard who first made the connection. He had been present for both reports. He hadn't thought much of Vargas's sighting, that had been logged informally as a possible animal, but after Donovan's report, something about the similarity bothered him. He pulled Vargas aside the next morning and asked him casually to describe again what he'd seen on the ridge a few nights earlier. Vargas told him. The SOG listened without expression. Then he asked one question, "Did it look like it was facing you?" Vargas said he thought so but couldn't be sure. The SOG didn't follow up. He didn't file anything. He didn't tell Donovan what Vargas had seen. But according to the Marine I spoke with, who was close to the SOG and heard about this later, the SOG started making a point of being awake and outside the guardhouse during the 0000 to 0400 shift from that night forward. 3 things happened over the next 4 nights that elevated the situation from odd coincidence to something harder to categorize. The first was a report from Post 4, the roving post, 2 nights after Donovan's sighting. The Marine on the rover, a Lance Corporal I'll call Briggs, was walking the interior perimeter route at approximately 0245 when he stopped near the northwest corner and looked out through the wire. Briggs did not radio in a sighting. He did not report a figure. What he did was return to the guardhouse at the end of his shift and ask the SOG very quietly whether anyone else had ever seen somebody standing out there at night. The SOG asked him what he meant. Briggs said he'd stopped near Post 3 sector and noticed something on the ridgeline. He described it as a tall, still figure standing in a way that didn't look natural. Not the way a person stands when they're resting or waiting, but more like someone standing at a position of attention, arms at their sides facing directly toward the compound. He said he watched it for less than a minute. It didn't move. He looked down at his radio to key the handset, and when he looked back up, it wasn't there. Briggs had not been told about Vargas's or Donovan's sightings. He had no context. He was simply asking, in the careful way that junior Marines do when they're not sure whether they're about to be ridiculed, whether anyone else had seen something similar. The SOG told him no. The second event was more subtle, and I only have it secondhand. Sometime during this period, I'm not sure which night, the Post 1 sentry reported hearing something that he described as a low hum or vibration coming from outside the wire to the east. Not a vehicle. Not a generator. Something tonal and steady, lasting perhaps 30 seconds. He noted it in the logbook. The SOG acknowledged it. No follow-up was conducted. I mention this because several accounts of similar situations, not just this one, include reports of unusual sounds. Low hums. A pressure in the ears. A vibration that seemed to come from no clear direction. I don't want to overstate its significance here. It may have been equipment noise from the exercise, or an acoustic artifact of the terrain. But it was noted. And the Marine who reported it said it made him uneasy in a way he couldn't explain. The third event was the one that shifted the atmosphere inside the compound. On what I believe was the 8th or 9th night, a corporal, one of the more experienced Marines on the security detail, was posted at Post 2, the south-facing position, the one overlooking the wash. His name doesn't matter. What matters is what he saw and, more importantly, how he reacted. At approximately 0115, he radioed the COG and said, and I am paraphrasing from a description I was given, "I have a figure in the wash. Same spot Donovan described. Tall. No IR. Not moving. It's facing me." The COG asked how he knew about Donovan's report. The corporal said it didn't matter. He said, "Just get someone else over here to see this." The COG woke the SOG. The SOG walked to Post 2. By the time he arrived, which took, by most estimates, no more than 90 seconds, the corporal was still looking through his optics, still tracking the same position. And then the SOG looked. Here is where the accounts diverge in a way that has stayed with me. The corporal said the figure was still there. The SOG said the wash was empty. They were standing side by side, looking in the same direction, using comparable optics. And one of them saw a figure and the other did not. The corporal lowered his PVS-14 and looked with his naked eyes. He saw nothing. He raised the optics again. He said, and I was told this by someone who was present, "It's still there." The SOG looked again. Nothing. After approximately another minute, the corporal said it was gone. Neither man said anything for a while after that. The SOG eventually told the corporal to continue his watch and come see him at turnover. The corporal finished his shift. At 0400 he was relieved. He went to the guardhouse. What was said in that conversation I don't know in full. But I was told that the SOG asked the corporal to describe exactly what he had seen, and the corporal gave the same description that every other Marine had given. Tall, standing upright, arms at its sides, no equipment, no IR signature, motionless, facing the compound. The SOG reportedly said, "That's the same thing the others saw." The corporal asked how many others. The SOG told him. And according to the Marine who told me this part, the corporal's response was, "Then why are we still standing post like nothing's wrong?" That question is worth sitting with for a moment, because it marks the point in the account where the story shifts from a series of isolated observations to something that began to affect the Marines collectively, not because everyone saw the figure but because enough people had, and the information was now circulating. Within 24 hours the word was out. Not officially. Nobody briefed it. There was no formation, no command statement, no acknowledgement from the OIC. But Marines talk. And in a small compound with 40 people, information moves fast. By the 10th night, every Marine assigned to the midnight to 4 watch knew the pattern. After midnight, something was seen standing outside the perimeter, always facing the compound, always without IR, always gone before a second observer could confirm it with the original. The effect was immediate and, in some ways, predictable. Some Marines treated it as a joke. They'd reference it at chow or make comments about Donovan's girlfriend in the wash. That kind of humor is standard in the Corps. It's how Marines process discomfort. Dark humor as emotional insulation. But others, particularly those who had actually been on post when the sightings occurred, were quieter about it. Vargas, I was told, stopped talking about his sighting entirely. He'd change the subject if someone brought it up. Donovan became notably more tense during the pre-watch brief and was seen checking his optics repeatedly before going out to his post, as if he were expecting something to be there waiting. Briggs, the rover, asked to be moved off the midnight shift. His request was denied. They didn't have the bodies to rearrange the rotation. But the fact that he asked was noted. And the corporal who had seen the figure while the SOG had not, the one who had asked why they were still standing post like nothing was wrong, he reportedly started walking the compound at night during his off hours. Not on post. Not on duty. Just walking. As if he couldn't sleep or didn't want to. One of the Marines I spoke with described the overall mood during those last few days of the exercise as weird and tight. Not panicked. Not fearful exactly. Just altered. Like something had been introduced into the atmosphere of the compound that couldn't be removed by ignoring it. He said the Marines on post were still professional. They still did their job. But there was a carefulness to their behavior that hadn't been there before. Radio checks came in more frequently. Relief was requested more promptly. Turnover conversations were shorter, as if nobody wanted to linger at the post a second longer than they had to. And several Marines, he couldn't say exactly how many, but more than 2, started refusing to use their PVS-14s during certain parts of their shift. They said they preferred to watch with their naked eyes. When asked why, the answers were vague. One Marine reportedly said, "I just don't want to see anything I can't confirm is there." That statement has always stuck with me. Not because it's dramatic, but because of what it reveals about how these Marines were processing the experience. They weren't terrified. They weren't hysterical. They were managing their own perception. They were choosing not to look. The last significant sighting, and the one that, to me, is the most difficult to dismiss, occurred on what I believe was the second to last night of the exercise. The compound was scheduled to break down and convoy out within 48 hours. Operations were winding down. The mood should have been lighter. In some ways it was. But the midnight shift still had to be manned. The Marine on post 3 that night was someone who had not previously reported a sighting. I'll call him Reyes. He was a corporal, a squad leader from the logistics section who had been voluntold for the security detail when another Marine went down with heat exhaustion earlier in the exercise. He was not part of the original security element. He had heard the stories, but he told the Marine I spoke with that he thought they were, his word, stupid. Reyes was on post 3 from 0000 to 0400. The northwest corner. The same position where Vargas had made the first report. At approximately 0230, Reyes conducted a routine radio check. Everything normal. At approximately 0250, Reyes keyed his radio again. COG post 3. Post 3, go ahead. I have something on the ridge. Bearing 320. Maybe 200 meters. Post 3, say again. You said bearing 320? Affirm. There's someone standing up there. Tall. Not moving. No IR. There was a long pause. Post 3, copy. I'm sending the rover. But this time something was different. The rover, a Marine I'll call Torres, reached post 3's position within 2 minutes. He approached from the interior of the compound, came up alongside Reyes, and looked in the direction Reyes indicated. Torres saw it. For the first and only time in this entire sequence, 2 Marines observed the figure simultaneously. Both of them, standing at post 3, looking through their PVS 14s, saw a tall, upright shape on the low ridgeline to the northwest. Torres later described it to the Marine who told me this account. He said it looked like a person, but not exactly. The proportions were slightly wrong. The torso seemed too long relative to the legs, or the shoulders too narrow, or something about the posture was off in a way he couldn't fully articulate. He said it looked like someone doing a very good impression of standing still, but not quite getting it right. As if the thing on the ridge understood the concept of standing but had learned it from a description rather than experience. Both Marines watched the figure for what they estimated was between 3 and 4 minutes. During that time neither spoke. Neither moved. They simply watched. And then the figure was gone. Not in a dramatic way. Torres told my contact that he wasn't sure exactly when it disappeared. He didn't see it walk away or crouch down or fade. At some point during those minutes, he blinked or shifted his weight or adjusted his monocular, and when he looked again, the ridgeline was empty. Reyes confirmed the same thing. One moment it was there. The next it wasn't. And neither of them could identify the exact second it left. Torres and Reyes did not speak for a while afterward. Then Torres said, and this was relayed to me, "What the fuck was that?" Reyes didn't answer. Torres returned to his rover route. Reyes finished his shift. At turnover, Reyes reportedly told the oncoming post stander, "Don't look at the ridge." He did not explain further. The exercise ended. The compound was broken down. The Marines convoyed back to the main base, cleaned gear, returned equipment, and resumed their normal routine. No after-action report, to my knowledge, made any mention of anomalous sightings. No official log entry described what was seen. The SOG's informal notes, if they existed, were not preserved in any permanent record. But the account didn't disappear. In the weeks following the exercise, several of the Marines involved discussed the events among themselves. Not openly. Not in large groups. In pairs usually. Over cigarettes outside the barracks, or during downtime in the company office. They compared notes. They compared descriptions. And what they found was that every single account matched. The figure was always tall. Always standing. Always motionless. Always without infrared signature. Always facing the compound. Always observed after midnight. and always gone before it could be fully confirmed by an outside party. Except once on the last night when Torres and Reyes both saw it together. No one could explain why the SOG had seen nothing when he stood beside the corporal and looked in the same direction. No one could explain why the figure appeared to have no IR signature if it was a person. No one could explain why it was always facing the compound. And no one could explain the timing. Every sighting occurred between 0100 and 0300. Never before midnight. Never after dawn. As if whatever was out there operated on a schedule. I asked the Marine I spoke with whether he thought the sightings could have been the result of fatigue, suggestion, or expectation, the natural human tendency to see what you've been primed to look for. He considered this carefully. He said it was possible for the later sightings, after the word had gotten around. But not for the first three. Vargas, Donovan, and Briggs had no knowledge of each other's reports. They were on different posts, on different nights, and none of them had been briefed or warned. He also pointed out something that I hadn't considered. The figure was not always in the same place. Vargas saw it on the ridge to the northwest. Donovan saw it in the wash to the south. Briggs saw it on the ridge again. The corporal saw it in the wash. Reyes and Torres saw it on the ridge. It appeared in at least 2 different locations at varying distances, as if it were circling the compound from outside the illuminated perimeter. That detail makes the suggestion explanation harder to sustain. If Marines were simply seeing what they expected to see, you'd expect the reports to cluster at the same spot, the place they'd been told to watch. Instead, the figure seemed to move. Not while being observed, but between observations. I want to be transparent about something. I have tried to find other reports from the same training area. The region in question is vast, over 900 square miles of federally controlled desert, and Marines have been training there for decades. It would be strange if nobody else had ever reported something similar. And in fact they have. I've encountered scattered references, in forum posts, in second-hand accounts, in conversations with Marines who trained there in other years, to unusual observations made during nighttime operations in the same general area. The descriptions vary. Some involve lights. Some involve sounds. A few involve figures. One account, which I found on a veterans forum several years ago, described a Marine in the early 2000s who was on a night land navigation course and reported seeing a person standing motionless at his third point, directly on the stake, staring at him. When he approached to within about 20 meters, the figure was gone. He assumed it was another Marine who had gotten to the point before him and moved on. But when he reached the stake, there were no boot prints in the sand besides his own. Another account, this one told to me by a Marine who deployed from the same base, described a patrol exercise in which an entire fire team reported hearing what they called a tapping sound coming from a specific direction in the desert. They moved toward it. The sound moved away. They stopped. The sound stopped. They moved again. The sound resumed, maintaining the same distance. After 10 minutes, the fire team leader called it off and rerouted the patrol. I have no way to verify either of these accounts. I include them because they describe a similar quality of experience. Something observed in the desert at night, something that behaved in a way that suggested awareness without confirming it, something that left no physical trace. The Mojave is not a small or simple landscape. It is old terrain. Long before any military installation was built there, the region was known to indigenous peoples who had their own accounts of things seen in the desert at night. I'm not going to pretend I know enough about those traditions to summarize them responsibly. But I will note that the concept of something standing and watching from a distance, something that looks human but isn't, something that observes but does not approach, appears in the oral histories of more than one southwestern tribal tradition. Whether that's relevant here or merely coincidental, I genuinely don't know. What I do know is that the Marines who experienced these events were not inclined toward folklore. They were not reading ghost stories. They were not primed by cultural context. They were tired, they were pulling post in the middle of the desert, and they saw something they couldn't explain. And when they compared their descriptions afterward, they found that they had all seen the same thing. I want to return to something the corporal said on that night when the SOG stood beside him and saw nothing. He asked, "Why are we still standing post like nothing's wrong?" It's a reasonable question. And the answer, of course, is because there was no official framework for something being wrong. No Marine was injured. No perimeter was breached. No hostile intent was demonstrated. The figure, whatever it was, never approached, never spoke, never made a threatening gesture. It simply stood there, observed, and disappeared. In military terms, there was nothing to report. Nothing that fit into a salute report format. Nothing that justified waking the OIC or contacting higher headquarters. The sightings were, in the language of the bureaucracy, non-events. And yet, 5 Marines saw the same thing. Their descriptions were consistent in detail. The sightings occurred over a span of nearly 2 weeks, in 2 different locations relative to the compound, always during the same window of time. One sighting was confirmed by a second observer. And in one case, 2 Marines standing in the same position, using similar optics, simultaneously saw different things, or rather, one saw something and the other saw nothing. That last detail is the one I keep returning to. If the figure were a real, physical object, a person, an animal, a piece of terrain misidentified, then both observers should have seen it. They were standing side by side. The conditions were identical. There is no clean optical explanation for why one PVS-14 would render a shape that another, pointed in the same direction, would not. Unless what was being observed wasn't entirely optical. I don't know what that means. I'm not proposing a theory. I'm describing an inconsistency that I can't resolve, and that the Marines involved couldn't resolve either. Maybe there is a reasonable explanation for most of what was reported here. Fatigue is real. Expectation effects are real. The human eye, particularly through image-intensifying optics in low light, can construct shapes from noise, can find figures in the static of the desert the way we find faces in clouds. But that explanation requires us to accept that 5 Marines across 11 nights independently hallucinated the same figure in the same posture, with the same specific characteristics, including the absence of infrared signature, a technical detail that most junior Marines would not think to fabricate or imagine. And it requires us to explain the Torres Reyes sighting, where 2 Marines saw it at the same time, described it the same way, and watched it for several minutes. And it requires us to explain why, on one occasion, it was visible to one trained observer and invisible to another standing right beside him. I don't have an explanation that covers all of that. I have partial explanations. I have maybes. I have reasonable sounding frameworks that work for 70% of the data and collapse on the rest. And in my experience, that's exactly how these stories tend to end. Not with a clear answer, but with a gap, a space where the explanation should be and isn't. The Marines who were involved in these events went back to their regular duties. Most of them finished their enlistments. A few re-enlisted. At least one deployed again within the year. None of them, as far as I know, filed any kind of formal report. There was nothing to file it under. There was no mechanism, no checkbox, no category in any Marine Corps reporting system for figure observed outside perimeter, no IR, unable to classify, vanished before confirmation. The SU, the one who had been awake every night, who had connected the reports, who had stood at post 2 and seen nothing while the corporal beside him saw something. He never discussed it publicly. The Marine who told me about him said that if you brought it up, the SOG would get very still, and then change the subject. Reyes, the skeptic, the one who thought the stories were stupid until he stood at post 3 and saw it himself, he reportedly said only one thing about the experience after it was over. He said it to Torres, the Marine who had seen it with him. He said, "I don't think it was out there for us." Torres asked what he meant. Reyes said, "I think it's always out there. I think we just happened to be looking." I don't know if that's true. I don't know if anything I've told you today is true in the way that a lab result or a satellite image is true. What I know is that these Marines saw something, that their accounts are consistent, that no satisfying explanation has been offered, and that the experience, quiet and bloodless as it was, changed the way some of them think about what might be standing in the dark just outside the light when nobody is watching. Or when somebody is. I'll close with this. I think the reason accounts like this one linger, the reason they're hard to shake even when no one was hurt and nothing was confirmed, is because they don't behave like stories. They behave like data. Imperfect data, yes. Fragmented. Subject to bias and error and all the limitations of human perception. But consistent. Independently consistent. And in my experience, the accounts that stay with you the longest aren't the ones where something terrible happened. They're the ones where something almost happened. Where something was there and then it wasn't. Where the only evidence that anything occurred at all is a handful of people who saw the same impossible thing and then had to go on with their lives as if they hadn't. If you've had an experience like this, military or otherwise, I'd like to hear about it. Not because I'm collecting proof of anything, but because I've found that the people who've seen things like this often carry them alone for a very long time. And sometimes just knowing that someone else saw the same thing is enough to make the weight a little easier to hold. Thank you for listening. I'll see you in the next one.